Hi, my name is Jenny van Rensburg. I'm a senior counsel. I'm continuing with my lecture on criminal procedure. The state has now completed its case. It closed its case. Now, what will follow logically, depending on the circumstances, is if there's no evidence against your client or you want to take a good chance, you will then proceed to ask for a discharge in terms of Section 174 of the Criminal Procedure Act. Now, what this means is that after the state has led its evidence, you will then stand up and you can either request the court for the indulgence for some time to prepare, especially if it is quite a long and difficult case. And then you will have to serve your application on the state for the prosecutor to have a look at it. Now, there are two factors here. The one is if there are no prima facie case. In other words, you are going to sit down and you are going to analyze the evidence that was led against your client, and then you will make some recommendations. Is there any corroboration? Was your client incriminated? Was there the principle of disassociation? Was there any common purpose? It takes a little bit of time to go and sort out exactly what's going on. Other cases are straightforward. The state produced its evidence. There's no incriminating evidence against your client. At the end of the day, you just stand up and say, my lord, there's no incriminating evidence against my client. I'm requesting a discharge in terms of Section 174. And the state will stand up and say, I agree. And then the judge will just say very shortly, there's an application for Section 174, the evidence against accused number, there are no evidence against accused number 1. Sir, you are discharged, you may leave the courtroom. Or it might become a little bit more technical, where you must then analyze the evidence and produce it, and it might take time to argue for an application in terms of Section 174. Be that as it may, at the end of the day, the judge can say or make a ruling and say application granted or application dismissed, and then you must make a decision whether you're going to put your client in the box or not. Now, it is a difficult decision at that stage to make, because if you put your client in the box to go and testify, the state is going to have a go at him. Make no mistake. If you don't put your client in the box, there's only one version before the court on which the court can find your client guilty. But if you have consulted with your client properly, and you know the facts and you know how to counter whatever the state has produced, you put your client in the box and you start asking him the questions. You say, sir, there's an allegation made that you were part of the gang who murdered Mr. A. What do you say about it? No, I wasn't there. You don't have to elaborate. Short questions. No, yes, I've been there, I deny, I do, I die. But in some instances, there's a little bit more. He must just not deny it. He must put his version before the court. And you will find that sometimes your client will start telling stories which differ from what he has told you, because he heard what the state is saying. So he's trying to counter whatever the state is saying, and that is a little bit dangerous. Because after your client have testified in evidence in chief, the state will come in under cross-examination and try to rip him apart. You have said this, but what about? But what do you say about this witness there, therefore? But your evidence now differs from your evidence in chief. They will try to rattle him. That's why cross-examination is there, to see whether your client can stick to his story. Because evidence in chief said, no, I wasn't there, I didn't do it, and all of a sudden the state will confront him and says, no, but wait a bit. that witness so and so, she said that while she was in the car, you were sitting in the back of her, and when they stopped there, you got out and you came around. How would she know it if you haven't been there? And then, like in good criminal law and practice, your clients start to talk the talk of the non-truth, and then you've got a problem. Because you must take note of what these deviations are, so that during re-examination at the end, after the state has had a go at him, you must try to close those gates and those gaps in between. But now you must also understand, that is why I always say you must hear to listen and listen to hear. Because at the end of the day, you are going to argue against a conviction, and the state is going to argue for a conviction. And believe me, it is not so difficult to find out that the witness is telling a lot of stories. And believe me, if you sit on the bench, you are alerted to different stories. And you will see the judge sit with his book and he will write. And sometimes he will, he'll make some other form of gesture with his hand, encircling words or underlining words or making an exclamation mark. You must take note of it, because then as soon as you must keep your eye on the witness and you must keep your eye on the judge. And as soon as you see the judge is making something, you must make a note there, because that is how the judge at the end of the day will say, but the witness said this, the accused said this, it doesn't tie up. I believe the witness, I don't believe the accused. And you must. Long ago, I also told you that you must teach your witness to give evidence. And it's difficult. Make no mistake. To be in a court and to give evidence in those circumstances, it's not one of the nicest things in life to do, because you tend to speak slowly and to drop your head. You must teach them. Face the judge. Give your evidence. Speak loud. Give the judge time to write down. Forget about the prosecutor. He can ask you questions until the cows come from wherever. Speak to the judge, address the judge, and be dressed properly. But now, all right, you get these inmates, they don't have clothes, they come in there with jeans and tackies, and they are shivering from the cold, and they are full of flu. It's not the nicest place to be. It's like being in the lion's den. But be that as it may, after your accused has given evidence, been cross-examined, and you get the chance to re-examine him, you must close the gaps, at least try to do it. When that is finished and you have got no witnesses, you close your case. Okay? Then what happens is there will be an address to the court for a finding of guilty or not guilty. And then you must know what you are doing, because you must summarize your evidence of all the witnesses, and you must summarize your evidence of your accused, and you must try to show the corroboration or no corroboration, or which witnesses should be believed and which witnesses should not be believed, etc., etc. It takes exercise to do it. It is not a matter of just writing an essay. In serious matters, you can request the court that you will address the court and write some heads of arguments. In the magistrates' court, they don't really allow it to a very great extent. I mean, if the state is closed, if you have closed your case, then it's rock and roll. You go for it. And unfortunately, there are some of our colleagues which are not up to it to really address the court. And please don't say, I'll leave it in the hands of the court, or the court has got a discretion. Address the court on what you want. There's no prima facie evidence against my client for the following reasons: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then the judge will go out and he will come back and he will give a judgment on guilty or not guilty. And if your client is found guilty, the next phase is then the sentencing. And where your client has been charged with serious misconduct and is up for life imprisonment. My advice is request a pre-sentencing report. The prosecutor is going to go through the roof, the judge is going to go through the roof, so be it. Because for the simple reason that all that you know is you met your client in prison, you don't know what his family background is, where did he stay, how his background to his schooling, his family, maybe he's married, maybe he's divorced, whatever the case might be. I have found, in a case of mine in Johannesburg, where 2 accused was up for theft of a motor vehicle, selling of a motor vehicle, fraud, etc., etc. Well, they were up for at least 10 years imprisonment, but they were awaiting trial already for nearly 4.5 years, well, for 2 years, and the trial took us 2 years. It was about 4.5 years which they were in prison. So, counsel requested time to get pre-sentencing reports. And when I saw the pre-sentencing reports on those 2 accused, they were 5, but those 2 specifically, it changed my mind. They were leaders in the community. They were good fathers. They were helping the community. They were part of the congregation, the church congregation. They did some welfare projects. The one guy was a mechanic. And the other one was a salesman. It changed my mind. Totally. So I gave them a suspended sentence because they were already in prison for about 5 years. Now, if I had to imprison them for another 10 years, it means that they would have been out of circulation for 15 years. That is not how it is done. And they were first-time offenders. That is why I say, if your client is up for a severe sentence, robbery with aggravating circumstances, the minimum is 15 years. For murder committed under certain circumstances, gone, life imprisonment. So please, you are there to protect your client's interests. Although he might be a criminal, it doesn't make him a bad person. In the definition of innocent and guilty persons, he might have been at the wrong place at the wrong time. We've all been there. Luckily, we didn't end up with a sentence of life imprisonment. So, please insist on pre-sentencing reports because it's on record. If the court then say, no, it's not necessary, I don't care, at least you've got something to go on an appeal and tell the Court of Appeal, I have requested a pre-sentencing report for the benefit of my client, and the Court rejected my request. And that is a ground for an appeal. Make no mistake. Okay, your client has now you've now prepared and you've now argued on sentence, and your client's got, let's say, life imprisonment for murder and rape and robbery, whatever the case might be. Now you've got a right to appeal within 14 days thereafter in terms of Section 309B of the Criminal Procedure Act. There is a certain procedure, a pro forma type of thing that you must complete. Give the reasons and say the judge didn't do the following, he misinterpreted it, the sentence is shocking and inappropriate, etc., etc., etc. Then you must also have the record of the proceedings before the court typed, and then you apply for leave to appeal. And if leave to appeal is granted, you proceed with the appeal. If leave to appeal is not granted, then you petition to the Chief Justice, and then they will decide whether your petition on sentencing and or on guilty, fine of guilty, and or sentencing will then be approved or dismissed. If it's approved, you carry on with an appeal. If it's dismissed, so be it. That's the end of the story. In very strange circumstances, you may then proceed in other ways and leeways and see whatever to the parole board and other instances to try to get your client not to be incarcerated for very long, but that is another story for another day. That, in short, is the process of criminal proceedings. I'm going to deal with some specific aspects hereafter in more videos. So for the sequence up until now, I think you should have a good indication of how criminal proceedings work. It is a standard proceeding. It is a standard set of specific facts and steps that follow each other thereafter. It is not difficult, but you must go and read you must know you must know the following: search and seizure procedures, arrest, bail and bail applications, section 60. You must know what is a plea of guilty in terms of section 112. You must know what is a plea explanation in terms of section 115. I will come to, you must know what is section 220 admissions. You must know what is a section 204 witness. I will come a little bit later back on pointing out and confessions and freely and voluntary and those type of phrases that is used. You must know the difference between an appeal and a review, and you must know the procedure of appeals. That is basically the broad outset of the specific sections that you must know, and you will also find that in your examination, and I will deal with some other specific aspects in the lectures to come, which you must also take note of. There's a lot of information that I've given to you in some books, but I will refer to that in the next lecture. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and stay well. Thank you.